Today on Blue 58, the Packers' safeties were the offseason subjects of Extreme Makeover Football Edition. What does that add up to this year?
Blue 58!
Hello and welcome to another episode of Blue 58, the one and only podcast of thepowersweep.com. I'm your host, John Meerdink, and I'm happy to be with you here for another episode. I was thinking about Packers' safeties heading into this episode, as you might imagine, trying to contextualize what they did this past offseason beyond just this past offseason. You can expand it out a little bit to just trying to course correct, I guess, post Darnell Savage, but I think it's bigger than that. I think you look back at the kind of concentric rings of Packers safety development over the past decade plus now, and it kind of looks like everything is just trying to course correct for Nick Collins' injury. The Packers are trying to figure out or fix the safety position for the first time since they last had a real dynamic playmaker at safety. You lose Nick Collins, Morgan Burnett steps into a bigger role. It's not a one-to-one role with Collins, but he was their last bona fide big expenditure of resources at safety that really worked out, maybe outside of Adrian Amos. You move Charles Woodson to safety for 2012. That doesn't really work out because he's injured for a lot of that season. You bring in M.D. Jennings and Jerron McMillan. Neither of those things really works out, especially M.D. Jennings and the Fail Mary. You draft Clinton Dix. You sign Adrian Amos. You draft Darnell Savage. None of those guys have ever been a long-term answer. Adrian Amos, of all those guys, probably is the closest thing to a real high-level, long-term answer at safety. Maybe Morgan Burnett after him. Clinton Dix had a season and a half of good play. Darnell Savage, maybe a season of good play spread across 2 years. It's all been kind of this eternal question, not eternal, but 13 years, you get it. This long-term question of, can we finally get a dynamic playmaker at safety since Nick Collins' untimely injury? Coupled with that is the use of safeties in the Packers' defense. Dom Capers wanted to do things one way. Mike Pettin wanted to do things another way. Joe Barry wanted to do things his own way. And then you've got Jeff Hafley, who gets another crack at it now. Of all the things in the post-Jeff Hafley hire discussion, his discussions and points about safeties have really come to the fore here. And I won't belabor the point here, but one of the things that back when he was hired that you could find the most audio about was him talking about what he wanted from safeties. And that really comes down to the coverages he likes to play with safeties. Modern defenses are built back to front. They're built from the safeties to the corners to the linebackers to the defensive line. Because I think that's the order of complexity here for how things are handled. Safeties have a lot of responsibility for positioning, so do corners, but their jobs are always going to be complicated. Then linebackers after that, then the defensive line and your edge rushers after that. Kind of like we said in the linebackers issue and in the cornerbacks issue or episode 2, the front seven's job is pretty straightforward. You're going to do basically the same things regardless of schemes. Your individual responsibilities are going to vary play to play, but overall within the scheme, it's basically set. Your defensive tackles are going to do what they do. The defensive ends are going to do what they do. But the real, I guess, tone setters, for lack of a better term here, for your defense, the people who really define the geography of your defense are going to be your safeties. Do you play 2 deep, 3 deep, 1 deep? What do you do with your other safety if it's a middle-of-the-field close coverage? Do you have him near the box? Do you have him as your quasi-nickel corner? There's a lot of different philosophical things there. So that, coupled with the Packers' resource expenditure at safety this offseason, really makes safety a very interesting position and a good one to, I guess, end on here as we get ready for training camp kicking off this week in Green Bay. Is all that going to work? I don't know, and I don't think this is the podcast for trying to answer that. But we can say, since Nick Collins' injury, this is the biggest expenditure of resources the Packers have made at safety since then. They're really going for it. They're trying to get this safety position right. And they've made 4 bets at the position this offseason, in addition to some last season, who have carried over to this year too. Well, whether or not it works is going to be a long-term question here. Not just half a season, not just this season. It's going to be a year, 2 years, 3 years from now. Did the Packers' safety moves in 2024 fix their position? We might not know until 2026. We might not know until we're looking at the end of Xavier McKinney's time in Green Bay. Did that work? Was that a good idea? It's going to be an open question for a while, but it's a big important question for the Packers defense over these next couple of years in the early Jeff Hafley era. Before we dive into the individual players here, again, a reminder about our Substack drive here. The free Substack subscription, the powersweep.substack.com, is where I need you to be if you want to be a part of our polling efforts for this year. If you prefer an alternative to Patreon and you'd like to support us financially there, that's an option that's open to you as well. If you've chosen to do that, and a few of you have, I will be reaching out within the next week or so about some merch options for you, because we can't do the automatic fulfillment through Substack like we do through Patreon. So stay tuned for that. Be sure to check in on your other benefits. But if you want to take part in our polling issues, our polling efforts, I guess, this year like we've done on Twitter in the past, head to the powersweep.substack.com and sign up there. You can participate in our weekly polling stuff throughout this season and hopefully beyond. The actual safeties here are pretty simple. We don't have all that many to look at, but I think that's how the Packers want it. They're going more with a quality group than a quantity group, and you don't really need that many anyway. You're looking at 5 roster spots, maybe 6 if you go with a lot. But I think the Packers could realistically even go as low as 4 on the roster this year, and then just kind of rotate in some other guys based on injuries and practice squad availability and some of the stuff like that. But it's not just an overly huge group, because you don't need tons and tons of them. You're going to have a smaller safety room than your corner room, and your safety room is going to be smaller than almost every other defensive position outside of that too. So we start with our no expectations group. We've only got one guy to mention here. Tyler Coyle signed with the Packers in January after being essentially out of football for 2023. Was an undrafted free agent out of Purdue in 2021 and signed with the Cowboys, appearing in 3 games over the next couple of years as a result. Had 6 tackles on defense in that span, 3 on special teams, was cut by the Cowboys at the end of their 2023 training camp and didn't latch on, at least according to his Packers.com bio, with anybody in the meantime there. Was not playing meaningful football in 2023, put it that way. I think you see why we have him in the no expectations camp, especially considering that the Packers had a big money free agent signing, a 2nd-round pick, a 4th-round pick. Was Evan Williams? Yeah, he was, or a 3rd or 4th-round pick. It doesn't matter. A day 2 pick, day 3 pick, a 3rd option there, and then Ketan Oladapo, who was a day 3 pick there as well. So you can see why the low roster guys are in a bit of a pickle heading into this year's training camp. That, of course, brings us to the first in our low expectations group, Benny Sapp III, who I thought was a fairly intriguing undrafted free agent last year, and in a normal year I think would be intriguing again this year. He had some deep safety and box safety experience, which made him a little bit of an outlier among safeties we looked at last year. He was a pretty good athlete, had some good testing numbers, and then he stuck around last year and appeared in 5 games, 3 snaps on defense, 40 on special teams. But then, unfortunately, he ends up being the kind of guy who gets shoved out when you start renovating. You bring in your big free agents. You start drafting guys. You draft another guy. You draft a 3rd guy. Suddenly, that guy who was an undrafted free agent story is shoved to the periphery. But I feel like you see guys like this fairly often stick around, and then you wonder why you wanted to get rid of them so bad in the first place. I'm not saying that's the case specifically with Sapp here, but sometimes guys who have experience, who've made it through the gauntlet once already, you reflexively assume that, okay, this is going to be it for him. They're going to move on from him because, well, look at what they've done here. And then he sneaks on the back end of the roster, or he hangs around in the practice squad, or what have you. Again, I don't know if that's the case with Sapp this year. He's got his objective, though. He meets expectations by doing one thing. He's got to survive. It's not dissimilar from Rasheed Walker, except he doesn't have the benefit of having started a bunch of games at a premium position. He proved himself last year. Now he's got to go and do it all over again. I think he's going to make it. I think he's going to make it to the practice squad, and I think he makes it to the roster and even ends up on the field for at least 5 games this year. I think Sapp has a skill set that is probably more useful to the Packers than even a guy like Anthony Johnson, who we'll talk about here next. But I think he's going to stick around for a while. That's my prediction for Sapp. This year maybe and beyond, but I think he's going to be tough to get rid of in Green Bay. Speaking of Johnson, a 2023 seventh-round pick that got a real honest shot down the stretch last year. We've talked about this ad nauseum, so I won't go too deep into it again. But near midseason, they decided we're done with Rudy Ford. He's not part of the future here. We want to get a look at Anthony Johnson. They did, and then what happened next? They signed the premium safety on the market and drafted 3 other safeties. What does that tell you about how the Anthony Johnson experiment went last season? I think the Packers saw all they needed to see at that point. To be fair, Johnson is still pretty early in the safety thing. He was a corner for most of his college career. His time with the Packers is really his first extended experience playing safety at any level. But the Packers still went out and signed Xavier McKinney and drafted 3 safeties. It's going to be tough sledding to make the 53-man roster. I think you're looking for a more dynamic special teams candidate if you want to get him to the roster. And I think it comes down to him and Sapp in a fight from that perspective. Like Sapp, his objective here is to survive, and I think he's going to make it in the short term. I think he's going to start the season on the 53-man roster, in part because of the guy who's coming next in our discussion, and then who knows from there. It gets a little bit rocky once you start getting through the early portions of the season as the Packers really start to look toward the future, but I think Johnson is going to make it as their last safety on the roster in the meantime. But then we've got Ketan Oladapo, who probably is going to be the guy that shoves either Sapp or Johnson off the roster for good at some point. Along with Jacob Monk, he is my other favorite day 3 pick. On paper, he checks all the boxes. He's a big athletic safety who plays near the line of scrimmage. He has a very specific role. He has a very specific objective at the NFL. He looks like he has all the athleticism to do it, with the caveat that we don't play games on paper, and with the additional caveat that he's coming into the season injured. He's on the non-football injury list due to an injury sustained in training heading up to the NFL draft. We probably should look at this as something of a redshirt year for him. He might start the season on one of the various lists that you can go on, the non-football injury list, the physically unable to perform list, or he could be at one of the beneficiaries of a new rule change, depending how long this injury lingers. There is a new rule in effect for this year that you don't have to carry a guy through final cuts, then put him on rosters on injured reserve after everybody clears waivers and all that. You don't have to do that anymore just to prevent you from stashing guys on injured reserve. And now the rule is that you can designate guys who are going to come off of injured reserve before you make those final cuts. So that's going to be a new roster building tool for guys like Brian Gutekunst. So that could really benefit a guy like Oladapo, who doesn't have to stay on the 53 just to make it through those cuts and all that. The Packers can just put him on IR when it's final cut down time and then carry him through final roster cuts and stuff that way. That could be the way forward for Oladapo. I think anything he contributes this year is probably a bonus. As good as the profile looks on paper, all the things that he could theoretically do, the athleticism and stuff like that, the injury, wiping out his offseason and early training camp stuff here is a big deal. And making the jump to the NFL is going to be accordingly much harder for him. So let's see how this injury situation shakes out first. Let's see what he does in terms of recovery stuff and when he's ready to go before we get too far down the path here, though. But I think starting with low expectations for Oladapo is going to be the way to go. Prediction-wise, I think he's going to be primarily a special teamer this year. Like, he's got all the physical tools, and he can probably do it. He could probably do the things you need to do to be a successful special teamer, whatever special teams ends up looking like in the 2024 NFL. So I think he's going to play about 3 times as many snaps on special teams as on defense this year. But that's the way forward for him in the short term. As he figures out what it takes to be an NFL player, gets on the field to practice with defense and stuff like that, which he hasn't done this offseason yet. It's going to be a while for him to come along. But looking at him primarily as a special teams player is probably the lowest frustration level way to go forward with this whole thing with Oladapo. So that brings us to the loneliest here in our safety predictions or preview effort here. the moderate expectations group, and there alone is Evan Williams. The first guy I think who's really a major part of the safety revamp, the first of three. I think he's a really interesting player. Maybe a tad overdrafted, but I think the Packers are seeing a couple specific things when they look at Evan Williams and his time in college career. First of all, remember that he played most of his career 4 seasons at Fresno State, not just at Oregon. Final season there at Oregon, not inconsiderable, playing at a much bigger program there, but most of his career was at Fresno State. I don't mean that as a value judgment one way or another, just worth remembering. But first, he consistently played a lot of box safety. As much as we've made of Javon Bullard doing essentially a season's worth of stuff in the slot, Williams has a long history of doing box and slot work, playing near the line of scrimmage, put it that way. He does a lot of it. He's done it a lot. He did it a lot at Fresno State and at Oregon. Secondly, he has consistently made plays on the ball. 29 ball hawks, maybe more depending on how you count the half ones there, but about 29, 30 ball hawks in that area in his college career. He made a lot of plays on the ball. Not inconsiderable considering his athletic profile, which generally good but not great. That's good. A good place for him to be. I think the Packers look at that and see a guy who has some versatility, who fills a role that some of their other safeties don't necessarily fill, and has enough athleticism to get the job done, and got the job done as often as not, more often than not maybe, in college. But moderate expectations too, because he seems to pretty clearly be third in the pecking order here. He's much more limited as a player than Javon Bullard or Xavier McKinney, and I think his role being that sort of box safety, maybe floating around quasi-linebacker, is a little bit less defined, which can work against him, but I think in some ways works in his favor as well. For this season, I think Williams is going to need to be like a spot fill sort of player. He may not have a super specific role carved out for him, but he's going to fill in wherever Xavier McKinney or Javon Bullard are not, or maybe cannot be in light of injury or something like that. I think that's an important role, but maybe not a well-defined one, but he seems to have the skills to fit in there. Enough athleticism, a versatile playing profile, background, and a history of making plays on the ball. He may be limited as a player. Those are some pretty good limits to work within if that's your profile as a player. I think he can be good, and I think there's a lot to like about his game, and I think he can do a good job for the Packers this year and in years to come. Prediction-wise, I think he finishes this year, this is not going too far out on a limb, but with the third most snaps among safeties. I don't think there's a real battle for playing time with him and any of the guys that are below him on the depth chart right now, and I don't think he's really going to threaten, certainly not Xavier McKinney and probably not Javon Bullard for playing time this year. I also think he's going to make his share of plays on the ball, put me down for 6 or more ball hawks as a rookie for Evan Williams, and then 150 more or more snaps on special teams. I think that's his quickest path to playing time this year, getting involved on special teams, and I think he's going to do that. Then our high expectations crew. No surprises here. You've got Javon Bullard and you've got Xavier McKinney. Let's start with Bullard. Bullard profiled as one of the best safeties among those traditional deep safeties in the draft this year. But as we've mentioned already in this podcast and many other places, he offers some slot versatility too. If you wanted to draft another version of Xavier McKinney to go along with your newly signed Xavier McKinney, this was going to be your guy. That solid deep safety profile, his final year with Georgia, the solid slot background before that. In theory, if you're looking for guys that can play the bulk of your snaps at safety and have sort of interchangeable roles depending on who you're playing and what you want to do with them in a given week, this is the guy you wanted. And this is the guy that you wanted to pair with Xavier McKinney. If you were rebuilding your safety room and you wanted 2 interchangeable safeties with similar skill sets, these were 2 pretty good guys. And I think as a result, a lot hangs on Javon Bullard this season. I wrote at thepowersweep.com, I guess it's going to be last week now, about how the weight of expectations for this rookie class essentially hangs on Javon Bullard. He, of all the rookies, is going to be counted on, I think, to have the biggest role start to finish this season and really be their earliest contributor. Look at the other guys kind of in his neighborhood here. You've got Jordan Morgan, who's not a starter right now and may not even be at any point this season. You've got Edgerrin Cooper, who's not technically a starter, and may not be this year, who may just be behind Quay Walker, though depending on how you stack your linebackers, who knows, but is not their primary option at linebacker, put it that way. And I think as such has a ceiling to his opportunities for this year. You've got Evan Williams, who's already behind two other safeties. You've got Tyron Hopper, who is essentially in the same boat as Williams and maybe not even that high up the pecking order there. But Javon Bullard is going to be one of the centerpieces of the Packers' safety rebuild. Definitionally, he is one of the centerpieces. He's one of their two biggest expenditures at the position this offseason. You've got McKinney, who they gave an extremely rich free agent contract to, and then you've got Bullard, a second-round pick. No one among the rookie class is going to have more early opportunities than Javon Bullard, and nobody, I think, season long is going to have the same sort of opportunities as him as well. Say, for instance, Jordan Morgan is not a starter to start the season, a fairly safe bet, even though it's probably equally safe that he could sneak into the starting lineup. Say he's not a starter at the early portions of this season. If he, say by week 8 or 9, is in the starting lineup at guard or at tackle or whatever, well, I guess that's it. He's not going to be the starter at center. The Packers have made that abundantly clear. No one is taking Josh Myers' job. He's going to take some time to settle into his role as a starter. Javon Bullard is in a similar sort of situation, figuring things out as a starter here, except he's going to go through that process a couple of months ahead of where Morgan will be. That puts him in a much different spot than any of these other young ascending players on the Packers. So how does he meet expectations this year? How does he live up to those high expectations? He's got to be a starting caliber safety essentially from the word go. This is a fairly high stakes version of that snap eater role that we talked about. He may not be the be-all, end-all at safety. That's pretty clearly Xavier McKinney. He may not be one of the Packers' best defensive players this year, but he's going to be on the field a bunch, and he's going to be counted on to be essentially not a liability. We may not need you to be a super-duper playmaker this year, but you can't be making us look bad when we're out there on defense. You can't be the reason that our defense is failing. Pretty high expectations, I would say, for a rookie. I think he's going to start every game for the Packers this year. I think he's going to finish the season easily in their top 5 in defensive snaps. And I think somewhere between 8 and 12 ball hawks this year. 8 or more, but fewer than 12. 12 or fewer. I think that's just what he's going to fall into as a result of the role that he's probably going to have, being on the field a lot for the Packers this year. Finally, Xavier McKinney. Of the players on the Packers, who are you paying the most attention to this year? For me, McKinney's going to be at or near the top. Yeah, we want to see what Jordan Love does here in what amounts to year 2. Yeah, we want to see what all the young receivers do in year 2 of their time together. McKinney is the big swing on defense. He's their big new shiny object, for lack of a better term there. No one is going to have more pressure on them, I think, on defense, other than maybe Jair Alexander, who needs a bounce back year. Rashawn Gary may have tailed off down the stretch last year, but he started so strong, and we know what he can do, and he had the kind of built-in excuse of the injury. Jair Alexander really had no such excuse. He was dinged up throughout the year, but he kind of went rogue there a little while at the end of the year. He needs a bounce back year. Kenny Clark is aging. Still very good. He has nothing to prove, though. McKinney is among the best players on the Packers defense, the one with the most to prove, because he's been a pretty good pro to this point. Now he's getting paid like one of the best safeties in the history of the game. How good is he actually going to be? Those are some pretty high expectations. What are the Packers counting on him to be? They're counting on him to be a centerpiece of their defense. Can he do that? Remains to be seen, but that's a pretty high bar. And this is why high expectation guys sometimes are not very interesting to talk about. What's there to explain about what the Packers need from Xavier McKinney this year? The Packers are paying him like a super big deal. They're paying him at like one of the most important defensive signings ever, maybe since Charles Woodson. And Woodson didn't get like a game-breaking contract either. Xavier McKinney got more than Zadarius Smith, though, who in 2019 got a 4-year, $66 million deal. McKinney's deal, 4 years, $67 million. A safety being ahead of an edge rusher just 5 years later is a fairly big deal. It shows where the safety market has moved and where free agent contracts in general have moved since then. But certainly not as premium of a position as Smith's edge rusher contract was for, though. But that seems like a pretty good indication of the amount of pressure and where the hopes are for McKinney and the Packers this year. And he's got to play like it. That's not that shocking of a take. Again, it's why high expectations guys are sometimes boring to talk about. But he's got to fill a significant role for the Packers this year. The Packers need him to be the most impactful, the most versatile piece in their secondary, a leader on and off the field, a playmaker who is the stopper for these opposing offenses here. You can't just be this is going to sound like a shot at Adrian Amos, and it isn't, I promise you. But for all the good things that he brought to the Packers defense, he was not really a dynamic playmaker in that secondary. The thing for Adrian Amos was to be in the right place at the right time so they don't throw the ball in your direction. And he was that for a long time. Very assignment sure. He does all the right things. He's where he's supposed to be until his athleticism started to fade. He was that kind of guy. That's not what the Packers are paying McKinney to be. They're paying him like a top-flight defender regardless of position. They need him to be making plays on the ball, and he can't just sit back there as a deep safety and say, okay, I'm here, don't throw at me. He's got to be an active defender more than a passive defender sometimes. So, like Adrian Amos before him, I'm going to predict that he leads the Packers in defensive snaps. I think he gets 3 or more interceptions this year, and I think he finishes leading the Packers in ball hawks with 12 or more. I think that's a very doable profile for him. I think we're looking at a more broadly balanced defense in terms of who's making plays on the ball and stuff like that, but I think McKinney is going to have a chance to do a lot of that for the Packers, and I'm really interested to see how Hafley tailors game plans for him. He seems to have a nice interchangeable piece with Javon Bullard, but McKinney is definitely going to be taking the lead here. The Packers are going to count on him to do that, and we'll see exactly what that looks like, what it amounts to here in the very near future. But that's all I've got for you in this episode of Blue 58. I appreciate you tuning in. I'd appreciate it even more if you'd take a second and share this episode with someone you think would enjoy it. That's going to help more people find the show and get more people involved in this conversation you and I are having about the Green Bay Packers, which in turn is going to help all of us, me included, become smarter Packers fans. And as I always say, smarter Packers fans are better Packers fans, and better Packers fans are what we all want to be. I'm your host, John Meerdink. We'll see you next time on Blue 58.